Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Calvin Coolidge, and the focus is law and politics. The year is 1895, a bit of a crossroads early in the life of Calvin Coolidge, as he is a college graduated from Amherst. The question is, where does he go next? Does he go back to his family and the family farm in Plymouth, Vermont, or perhaps does he pursue a professional career? Well, talked about it with his father, and they eventually decided he would pursue the law. Two choices here as well. Would he go to a law school, which were becoming increasingly more common in the late 19th century in the United States, or the more traditional route, which had been to study the law and read the law as an apprentice with an existing lawyer or practice? And frankly, economics played a role in this decision. The Coolidge simply couldn't afford law school, so he would try the apprentice route. And for that, he had to figure out where, and the opportunity came along actually very close to Amherst. On the other side of the Connecticut River was the city of Northampton, and there was the firm of Hammond and Field. Henry Field, John Hammond were both Amherst grads. They had established a very successful law practice in Northampton, and they decided to give Calvin Coolidge an opportunity to be their apprentice. Now, Northampton at the time is a city of about 18,000 folks, really known for having colleges and universities around. In addition to Amherst, you've got the Smith College for Women, Mount Holyoke College, the Massachusetts Agricultural College, and the Clark Institute for the Deaf, all within the surroundings of the Northampton area. Now, in terms of understanding and learning the law, there was not a lot of instruction or help coming from those partners, Hammond and Field. Calvin Coolidge got a desk, he got law books, and he had a lot of time to go study on his own, morning, noon, and night. And the other thing he did to learn was he went to court when it was in session, not to practice, but to learn, to watch, to see the different roles that people play, different styles. This was all part of his education as a lawyer. Again, he wasn't getting a lot of general instructions. He did well because he passed that bar and was welcomed into the legal fraternity about a year earlier than originally planned. It was 1897, just shy of his 25th birthday. He decided also to make a change. He had been born John Calvin Coolidge, although mostly known as Calvin. Occasionally had kept the John or a J period Calvin Coolidge in his official correspondence, but that was no more. He's a professional now. Going the rest of his life, he'll just be Calvin Coolidge. Where would he hand out his shingle now that he was a lawyer? Again, would he go back to Vermont, back to be close to the family, or would he stay perhaps in Massachusetts? And that's what he decided. In fact, he would stay in Northampton, set up his own legal shop just down the street from Hammond and Field. It's a tough beginning. In the first year, he made only $500. And he had $200 a month for his rent in his office. He had to pay his own personal rent and expenses as well. So he was in the habit of, when he needed money, he would write home. His father would send some cash, usually with no questions asked. What about politics? First entry for Calvin Coolidge was really to help those law partners, Henry Field and John Hammond, as they ran for office in Northampton. Field ran for mayor, Hammond ran for district attorney in different races, and Coolidge helped them both. They both won. It was a bit of a start. Now, Coolidge's own allegiance was to the Republican Party and had been really for quite some time. And so now we're at the 1896 national election. He's clearly pushing and pulling for William McKinley, who won the presidency over William Jennings Bryan. Now, what about himself, though? How did he get started? Well, basically as a volunteer, he was welcomed into the Republican City Committee of New Hampshire's, Northampton's Ward 2. It's a very small job. It was unpaid, but it was a start. And it started opening some doors. He then used that to get onto the city council, and then he was ready to run for his first elective office, and that was city solicitor, basically the attorney for the city of Northampton. Paid $600, so it actually could supplement his income that he could still have in his private practice, but he wasn't in this for the money. He was in it for experience. Coolidge later wrote that I wanted to be city solicitor because I believed it would make me a better lawyer. It gave me a start in the law, which I was ever after able to hold. He ran for that job, city solicitor, 1899. He won it. He won re-election in 1900, but he lost the race for re-election in 1901. It was one of only two races he would lose in his 30-year political career. So private practice is continuing, but he gets another opportunity, and this one came sort of out of nowhere. It was a pretty big honor. William Clapp had been the longtime clerk of the courts in Northampton, and he had been in a job that paid $2,300 a year, so some pretty good money. But he died in the middle of his term, and the judges in Northampton said, you know what, we need a lawyer to take over. and they picked Calvin Coolidge. He was quite honored by this. He took that job for the rest of the term, but then interestingly, he decided not to run for the position himself. He thought it was perhaps maybe too constraining, kind of a thing that he'd get locked into in a career position. He still wanted to keep his options open, stay agile in the marketplace, perhaps run for different kinds of office, and so he decided to decline. He'll stick with his private practice for now. Mostly what Calvin Coolidge wanted at this point in his life was a wife and a family, which was really difficult for someone who was so shy and had virtually no social skills. So how would he get started? Well, he was fortunate to meet Grace Goodhue, who was his neighbor. Now, she also had come to Massachusetts looking for opportunity from Vermont, so they had similar backgrounds. She had been going to school at the Clerk Institute for the Deaf to learn how to be a teacher of deaf students. And they met literally over the fence, had a brief conversation, and it was Grace that took the initiative. She sent Calvin Coolidge a potted plant as a gift. He responded by sending her his card, asking to meet socially, and the relationship began. Now, these two were essentially complete opposites. That's what Grace Coolidge's biographer Ishbel Ross wrote. No two people could have been more unlike. In all respects, Grace Coolidge was the opposite of Calvin Coolidge, except for their basic sincerity and high principles. She was gregarious, where he was solitary. She was joyous, where he was glum. She was responsive, where he was aloof. She loved a good time. He took a dim view of social pleasure. She was impulsive. He was cautious. But in some cases, opposites do attract, and so they started seeing each other. And there were a lot of sort of warning signals heading Grace's way. Some of her friends didn't think this was a good match. They took the sort of the quietness of Coolidge and his personality to be actually quite rude, was suggesting maybe she should move on. Also, her mother, Lemira Goodhue, also not in favor of Coolidge as a match, but Grace, she was okay, and she agreed to marry Calvin Coolidge October the 4th of 1905. They got married in her parents' home in Burlington, Vermont. It took a 2-week honeymoon that lasted only 1 week. They actually went to Montreal in Canada. After a week, Coolidge had said, look, we've seen it all. Let's go home. Let's save the rest of the money. We don't need to spend it here. Grace, also frugal, seemed to be fine with that. And besides, he had another campaign to run. He was running for the city school committee. This would be the second and final race he would lose in his career of politics. And this one had a twist because a second Republican was in the race. 2 Republicans against 1 Democrat. The Republicans split the votes, and Coolidge lost this contest. Now, this is a very sort of meager beginning to their existence. Coolidge does not have much money. Again, they're both relatively frugal, and they had very simple needs. So they decided to rent a part of a duplex at this house on Massasoit Street for all $27 a month. That was their total rent, and this would be a place that they would stay for a long, long time. Why? Well, Coolidge answered, so long as I lived there, I could be independent and serve the public without ever thinking that I could not maintain my position if I lost my office. This left me free to make my own decisions in accordance with what I thought was the public good. We lived where we did that I might better serve the people. And they would stay in this rental, half a duplex, throughout his entire career in Massachusetts, and even as vice president and president of the United States. This was the Coolidge home until his post-presidential years, when he would finally purchase his own home for the first time in his life. Now, Calvin Coolidge, not that easy to live with. Again, we've talked about it. He's quiet, keeps his feelings to himself, and he had very traditional beliefs on the role of men and women, frankly, staying in their own sphere. One example of this, Coolidge was going to go give a speech one night, and Grace put on her coat, and Coolidge asked where she was going. She said, oh, I thought I'd go out and hear you talk. His response, better not. They had a number of these kinds of interactions that are preserved for posterity. Sounds a bit harsh at times, but it doesn't seem like to them. They, again, came from the same stock, the Vermont Puritan background. They understood these different roles. They accepted them, committed to each other their entire lives. There doesn't seem to be any serious indication of dissatisfaction. From a distance, it can see that Coolidge, again, could be difficult to live with, but Grace seemed fine with him in their relationship. Of course, lasted the rest of his life, through their political times, all the way through the presidency and beyond. 11 months after they got married, they had their first child. They named him John. Grace, traditional role, would stay home, take care of the baby. Coolidge, run his law office, and of course run for office again. This time he's going for the state level. He's running for the lower house, the state House of Representatives, and again, very simple person. He had a very simple campaign style. He would go down the street, he would shake hands, basically say, I want your vote, I need it, I shall appreciate it. Not much more than that. He'd move on. He won this race by 264 votes. He was now going into state office. Now, for this created a change for the habits of Coolidge, because now for 6 months out of the year, he was going to need to be in Boston. That meant for him a commute. Took the train every Monday morning, 3 hours from Northampton to Boston. Every Friday evening, back from Boston to Northampton. So he was with Grace and the baby during the weekends. He would be in Boston during the week. His simple needs, where would he stay? The Adams House Hotel in a single room, shared bathroom down the hallway for $1 a day. First impressions for Calvin Coolidge at the state level weren't very good. One Democrat, Martin Lemansny, said, he looks like he's either a school teacher or an undertaker. That was his take on Calvin Coolidge. Now, Coolidge had a friend named Dick Irwin who wrote a letter to the House Speaker, John Cole, trying to sort of pump him up a little bit. He said, don't worry here. He's better than he looks, like a singed cat. That was the words from his friend Dick Irwin. Now, as far as Coolidge was concerned, he really did keep to himself. He studied. He was very well prepared when it came time to be on the floor of the House and actually talk legislation. But other than that, he barely said a word. He was not social. He kept to himself in his room alone at night, typically reading. Very simple habits, including when it came to food. One day there was a celebratory dinner that was given by the state senator Alan Treadway. Fancy foods, course after course being served. And at one point he looked over and realized that Coolidge wasn't touching his food. And so he came over and said, well, would you like something different? Should we have the chef prepare you something different? And first he said, no. And eventually he replied, well, if you insist, I'd like some dry toast and a cup of weak tea. Now, for many people, that really described Calvin Coolidge in the personality of weak toast, of dry toast, and a cup of weak tea. It sounded a lot like the personality of Calvin Coolidge. Now, during this period, this was a rise of the progressives, the first decade of the 20th century. Theodore Roosevelt is president. He is a progressive. He's a reformer, using government sort of as a force for good. And Coolidge and his voting in the state legislature actually aligned with many of these ideas, although over time, he would really back away from the progressive reforms, become much more of a conservative Republican, but he would certainly vote for some of these reforms at this point. He also found his first political patron in the state government, a mentor by the name of Murray Crane. Crane was the really Republican royalty at this point in the state of Massachusetts, currently serving as the senator from Massachusetts. He had been a former lieutenant governor and the former governor, and really took Coolidge under his wing. Coolidge admired and respected Crane. It was one of his most important political relationships that he would have. Rotation in office, again in Massachusetts, was common. After a couple of terms, you typically moved on. That's what Coolidge did here. After 2 terms in the House, went back home. They had their second child. Calvin Coolidge Jr. was born. Back to his law office and back to running again for office. This time for a local position, an executive position. Calvin Coolidge wanted to be mayor of Northampton. He ran, he won, he beat his friend, actually Harry Bicknell, in that race. Again, this was a part-time job, made only $800 a year. He still had his law office, but he really treated this like a full-time mayorship. That's what his view was. He wanted to be in City Hall where the people could find him. He also started finding his political voice on ideology, on topics. He wanted to lower taxes. He did. He wanted to cut spending. He did. Though he did raise teacher salaries, so that was an element that was in this mix. He served 2 terms, very proud of serving his 2 terms as mayor of Northampton, but always looking for that next rung on the political ladder. That came in 1911. Back to the State House. This time not in the House, but in the upper branch, the Senate. Very exclusive, only 40 people from across the state sitting in that upper house. He won that election, began his commute again, same personality, still very quiet, but serious. Again, focused, well prepared, worked with his colleagues on legislation, including at times across the aisle. He actually got the respect of many Democrats that were in the state legislature, but outside of that, again, very quiet and by himself. The next year, 1912, presidential election year, a very tough year for the Republicans. Theodore Roosevelt, now an ex-president, William Taft had been his handpicked successor. His presidency did not go well as far as the Roosevelt people were concerned, not nearly progressive enough. So Roosevelt comes back to run against Taft in 1912. It basically fractures the party at the national level, trickle-down effects in the state level as well. It hands Woodrow Wilson, the Democrat, the presidency. As for Coolidge, it didn't affect him. He was still elected to his second term rather, in the state Senate, and this is when he really started feeling like he was coming into his own. He wrote later that it was in my second term in the Senate I began to be a force in the Massachusetts legislature. I made progress because I studied subjects sufficiently to know a little more about them than anyone else on the floor. That was his strategy, and it was working. He was placed on some important committees, the Railroad Committee, the Rules Committee. He was still quiet, kept to himself, but often being productive now, well prepared, and preparing, in fact, for his next race, another step in the rung in that political ladder. But that is the story for another day. And that is Calvin Coolidge, Law and Politics, from the life of Calvin Coolidge. For more Presidential Chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.